Hello, and welcome to the monthly PsychCentral.com webinar series. We have a great presentation with a great presenter lined up for you, but before we get started, let's go ahead and do a couple of housekeeping items. First and foremost, we cannot see you or hear you. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in at any time, and at the conclusion of the presentation portion, I will moderate the questions to our presenter. Finally, you can only hear and see the slides. And well, that's really all we have. With that, Peg Streep is our presenter, and she is presenting Healing from an Unloving Mother. Peg, it's all yours.
Thank you. Well, good evening from the granite island called Manhattan. I'm pleased to have this forum this evening because if you're listening, you probably know what I'm about to tell you, which is this question of, in fact, the very topic of an unloving mother remains a cultural taboo. The culture clings to what I always call the mother myths, and the mother myths assume that 1, all women are nurturing, 2, all mothers are loving, and 3, mothering is instinctual. Alas, none of the 3 statements is in fact true. I'm a full-time writer. I am not a psychologist. I was trained in literature at both the graduate and undergraduate levels in the U.S. And I have been researching and writing about the mother-daughter relationship for close to 20 years now. I've had 2 books published, and I'm about to publish my 3rd in the coming weeks, called Daughter Detox: Recovering from an Unloving Mother and Reclaiming Your Life. I'm interested in the mother-daughter relationship, first of all, because I was an unloved daughter myself. And then late in life, I became a mother. And one of my goals, in fact, not surprisingly, was to be a loving mother in the way that my own mother had not been. So that really started the quest for me. I was originally interested in researching whether or not some of the truisms about mothers and daughters were actually scientific, such as all adolescent girls are rebellious and they are very difficult and the relationship is a mess. Actually, not true. That was the subject of my first book. The subject of my second book, Mean Mothers, really was an exploration of whether or not daughters who had been unloved could, in fact, become loving mothers themselves. And indeed, the answer to that is yes. One of the things that the cultural taboos do is that they make the unloved daughter feel as though she is the only girl on the planet whose mother doesn't love her. Every single daughter I have ever spoken to, including myself, assumed that she was the only one. Well, here's the scientific truth that all of you should hang on to. It's estimated that roughly 40 to 50% of all children do not get their emotional needs met in childhood. Now, that is a very large number as things go. So keep that in mind, that if you, in fact, had a childhood which was less than exemplary, in which you learned to feel lousy about yourself or feel as though you weren't good enough or somehow less than, and you had or still have a mother who displays behavior that cannot be identified as love, you have to trust me on this. You are absolutely not alone. Okay, so first up. Oh, this is great. My slide is not moving. Okay, why it's hard to see the wounds. Now, this is very anomalous and counterintuitive because many women wake up relatively late in life, in their late 20s, 30s, and 40s. They're unhappy. They don't know why they're unhappy. Their relationship to their mother has always been difficult, but they don't really see the connection between their unhappiness and that primal relationship. Why is that? Well, this is very important. The first reason is that the child's world is small, and she normalizes behavior. Each and every one of us grows up in a household where we believe, as children, that what happens at our house happens in houses everywhere. And it really doesn't matter where you grow up. That is your belief. And of course, that belief, it should be said, is aided and abetted by the fact that our parents, our mothers and our fathers, are really, they're the grown-ups. And they tell us what we should believe about the world we live in. And they really curate the truth about that little world. So the reality of it is that many unloved daughters, by the way, don't really realize that their childhood was, in fact, not the way other people's childhoods were until much, much later in life. They may recognize it because they marry into a family that's actually functional and caring, and they get to compare and contrast. They may become close to another woman whose mother responds in ways that are terrifically, terrifically different. So being able to see that this isn't the way things are everywhere takes a long time. The second reason is that her recognition of her treatment is impeded both by shame and the need to be loved. It's what I personally call the core conflict, which is the push-pull between the daughter's growing recognition that, in fact, she is wounded and her continuing need for her mother's love. And for many, many daughters, even into their 50s and 60s, somehow getting that love from her mother becomes the holy grail, the quest of all quests. And she keeps hoping, even though she knows better, that somehow she'll find the key to making her mother love her. That hopefulness, of course, also gets in the way of not only recognizing how you've been treated, but also acting upon it. The next point that's really important is that in many of these households, because of maternal treatment, she's been brought up to doubt her perceptions and thoughts. Either she has been told by her mother that what she feels and thinks is unimportant, or when she does express herself, she is told that she's simply wrong, or that it didn't happen, or that she's exaggerating, or that she's simply too sensitive, or that she's just being stupid. So, again, how do we figure out what is going on around us? Well, we begin from inside of us, but of course, you're at a terrific, terrific disadvantage is if you cannot believe either your eyes or your ears or your feelings. Okay, glimpsing the wounds. She may only glimpse the wounds by repeat patterns in adult life. That's absolutely true. Many women begin to connect the dots in later adulthood, at the end of their 20s and in their 30s. When they end up in a series of failed relationships, and they could be romantic relationships, they could be friendships, they could be working relationships that keep ending in the same way, and where she recognizes that the partners and friends and even colleagues that she's choosing echo her experience in childhood. Unfortunately, we are all drawn to what we know. And I always say the same thing. That's really dandy if you had loving parents, because the chances are that you're going to be drawn to people who are loving and caring and attentive and supporting. However, everyone is drawn to the familiar, and unloved daughters are drawn to what I call comfort zone that offers no comfort at all. In other words, if you are used to being pushed around, you will end up with a partner who pushes you around, and you won't even blink because you may not recognize that kind of behavior is not okay. Again, this goes back to the whole question of normalizing your treatment in childhood. And it takes a very long time for many daughters to really let go of the idea that it's normal, because they don't trust their own perceptions. So their thinking goes kind of like this: well, maybe she didn't mean to say that about me. Or maybe she's right. I am too sensitive. I mean, she might have just been joking. Again, it's that hopefulness that somehow this is all a very big mistake, and that there's misreading or something that just requires a small adjustment, and that everything will be okay. Now, the being okay thing is also really important, because most of all, the unloved child wants to be like everybody else. And by everybody else, I mean all those people that the mother myths describe. Those well-loved children, those mother-daughter pairs walking down the street together, laughing, doing things together, having lunch, being comfortable with each other. That's what the unloved daughter wants. And that is her profound hope, that she can somehow find a way of achieving that. And then finally, why the wounds are so hard to see. Many of the lessons that we learn in childhood become internalized as unconscious patterns of behavior. So we may become adults and act in a certain way in a relationship, and we don't trace that behavior back to its roots. So it's not as though you're in this screaming match with someone you care about, and it immediately flashes into your head, I'm reacting this way, I'm overreacting this way, because she is talking to me exactly as my mother did. Nope. That does not occur to you. You don't see it. So the problem is that being able to connect the dots between how your past experiences are affecting your present behavior takes a terrific amount of work, and most usually therapy as well, a lot of it. Okay, next, the 8 patterns of toxic maternal relationships. She is one scary looking person. No, this angry woman. All right. There are generalities that we can make about unloving mothers and their effects on their daughters. I mean, generally speaking, what we can say is most usually there are really major deficits in self-esteem. The unloved daughter doesn't learn to trust herself. The unloved daughter has difficulty managing her emotions. The unloved daughter has problems with boundaries. She doesn't necessarily recognize healthy ones. She has trouble navigating between being an island unto herself, completely independent, or clingy. That said, how your mother treats you most of the time has very specific effects on a daughter's development. Now, those of you who are familiar with my work know these categories are not set in stone, and many mothers, in fact, demonstrate either all at once or over time different behaviors, more than one behavior. So a controlling mother, for example, who's very controlling when a daughter is small, can become highly combative when the daughter hits adolescence and starts talking back. But let me go through these 8 patterns. Okay, the first pattern is the dismissive mother. Daughters have told me stories about being ignored in the most literal of ways. In other words, things as ordinary and banal, but consistently as, what would you like for breakfast? And the answer is, I'm really not hungry. And the mother says, oh, yes, you are. And places a heaping plate of something in front of the daughter, and then, of course, gets very angry if the daughter does not eat what's on her plate. Ignoring the child, ignoring her wants, ignoring her needs, pretending that she hasn't said anything, that happens too, or expressed desires or wishes, marginalizes the child and basically tells her that she doesn't have a place in this world and that she's not very important. So the common effects of a mother who dismisses you much of the time is difficulty identifying her own wants and needs, avoiding conflict even when she's been wronged. So in other words, the child who has been ignored in this way really doesn't even know how to stand up for herself because all she's used to is a disappearing act. These girls and later women are socially awkward. They have trouble sustaining relationships because, again, the primary relationship when they were small with their mother hasn't taught them normal give and take. And they don't know what normal give and take looks like. So one daughter told me the story, for example, of, being in grade school and going on play dates and being unable to tell her playmate what it was that she wanted to do. Do you want to play jacks? Do you want to play dolls? Do you want to color? And she was completely stymied. It was as though she was voiceless. And of course, the playmate, understandably, doesn't know where that's coming from and finds it weird and not a lot of fun. The daughter who's been dismissed is often interiorized. She's uncommunicative. And again, it's not because she has nothing to say. It's because she's been rendered pretty much voiceless and low self-esteem, unable to assert herself. Next up is the controlling mother. Now, the controlling mother, strangely enough, looks as though she's the opposite of the dismissive mother because the controlling mother is completely hands-on. But what they have in common is that neither of them is actually looking at the child in front of them. In other words, who the child actually is, what her likes are, what her dislikes are, what her gifts are, what her desires are, what her needs are, right, is irrelevant to both the dismissive mother and the controlling mother. Now, the controlling mothers see their children largely as extensions of themselves. They are usually very, very driven, tremendously success-oriented. Controlling mothers, I think, are very difficult for daughters to deal with emotionally, in part because they may be outwardly terrifically successful and admired by lots and lots of people. They tend to live, regardless of their socioeconomic background, their homes look good, their kids look neat. If they have a garden, it's beautiful. They're good cooks, they're community volunteers, etc. But of course, again, this daughter becomes pretty much voiceless because what she wants and who she is doesn't matter. So among the effects are she depends on other people to define her. And of course, that eventually, when she graduates out of her mother's direct control in middle school and high school, that can in fact be girlfriends or boyfriends who define her. And then later in life, lovers and spousers. She tends to be detached from her inner self because she really doesn't have any sense of who she is in there, really. She simply knows what her mother expects of her, and she acquiesces or rebels. Her attitude towards failure is tough because she lives in an environment where she's not allowed to fail. So if she does fall flat on her face, she's really likely to attribute failure to fixed character flaws, which in psychology is called self-criticism. So anytime things go wrong, rather than attributing it to bad luck, circumstances, instead you say, oh, it's because I'm worthless, I'm stupid, I'm dumb, etc. And then even on the success side, success doesn't give the controlled daughter much pleasure either, because she's more than likely to write it off to being a lucky thing. Or maybe she succeeded because her mother made it possible. As an adult, she's drawn to people who are like her mother, controlling people, because again, she's afraid of the downside to freedom, which is, of course, the ability to make a mistake. She wants to avoid that at all costs. And whether or not, she goes along or rebels, she's defined by reactivity. So she's never a standalone person. She's always part of some dyad. If not her mother, then it'll be a boyfriend or a girlfriend, later a husband. And she lacks emotional resilience. All right. Next, the emotionally unavailable mother. Now, this is perhaps the most toxic and the most confusing for a daughter, because this mother, more than likely, by the way, is physically present and probably doing all the things that society asks good mothers to do. In other words, the house is orderly, the food is cooked, the garden looks good, the clothes are provided, and so forth. But she's not home for her daughter. No matter what her daughter does, she cannot get her mother to respond to her emotionally. And that's really confusing, because particularly when you're young, how can someone be there and not be there at once? So among the effects of an emotionally unavailable daughter are the propensity for filling the hole in her heart with unhealthy substitutes and addictions. That could, of course, be food. It could be exercise. It could be overachieving. It could be shopping, addictive substances. This usually happens, obviously, not in childhood per se, but in adolescence and later. And once again, the daughter is very unlikely to connect this potentially self-destructive behavior to its root cause. Having a mother who's there but isn't means that she will lack trust. She's incredibly emotionally needy on the one hand, but on the other hand, she has a lot of trouble maintaining a balance in relationships, and she's usually unable to sustain them. Worse still, she doesn't really know how to act on what she's feeling because she's so frustrated. And the conflict that she feels is different from the controlling mother, because this mother is so close but so far at the same time. The unreliable mother presents some of the same problems. The unreliable mother is someone who can be at moments incredibly, incredibly distant, and then at the same time, incredibly, incredibly intrusive. So the child wobbles between feeling abandoned and shut out on the one hand and being absolutely subsumed on the other. And as a little kid, she never knows whether the good mommy or the bad mommy is going to show up. And this ambivalence in childhood is extremely, extremely difficult to deal with because the child doesn't have any way to prepare herself. Is it going to be the mommy who hugs her and kisses her so much that she really just wants to squirm out of there? Or is it the mommy who looks like a piece of stone? This daughter has great mistrust of people because of all the ambivalence. And she really doesn't get what drives people, what motivates them. She's usually very emotionally volatile, and she has a lot of trouble managing her negative feelings. She'll probably resort to walling herself off. Unfortunately, she's often drawn to abusive people because being connected, even if it's not a happy-making connection, is better to her and preferable than that stone-cold ice of the mom who's disappeared. She's also likely to mistake in her adult relationship control for both reliability or strength. That is, feeling as though that she's got somebody running her life gives her a sense of stability that her childhood lacked. Again, like all these other daughters, she has an impaired ability to process and identify feelings. And finally, she's really emotionally confused about her relationship to her mother. Because again, remember, this mother sometimes does show up. And so all of the hopefulness that all unloved daughters feel, that somehow they'll find that key to make it all work, is really amped up if the mother switches between the on position, the mushy, 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 I love you so much, I can't live without you, and don't bother me. All right. The most popular of all categories, the most written about. Yes, the self-involved, and I'll give in to the trends, the narcissistic mother. She who is high in narcissistic traits. Most of you know about narcissistic mothers. They tend to see their children, they do see their children as extensions of themselves as opposed to individuals in their own right. In one sense, they are aligned with the dismissive mother and the controlling mother because they don't see their children or child as whole people. However, they are also game players. They like controlling the household the way the controlling mother does, but the narcissistic mother really wants to be the sun and the children revolving planets. And that's the order that she seeks. So she will set one child off against another in order to keep that centrality. That is, the conversation always has to be about her. Alas, with this kind of self-involved mother, you're either in her sphere or out of your sphere. So I've written about it. You are either her trophy, or sometimes it's called a golden child, who can do no wrong because you're reflecting precisely what the mother wants, or the child may end up being the scapegoat or the odd girl out because she's not playing by the rules and mom doesn't like it. So the effects on the daughter are She is detached from her own feelings. She, again, doesn't have a sense of herself, so she lacks real self-esteem. And she really depends, because that's what she'd learned from her mother, she depends on external validation. You know, you are as good as the last good thing you did. She's unhappy, but she doesn't see why. She has problems with intimacy and closeness. Now, again, the trophy child, the child who's really lost in the glare of that maternal sun, probably doesn't have a clue to what's going on at all. She's not likely to see her woundedness. She's also not likely to see that she could be happier with a different kind of caring and attunement. The scapegoated child's in a different position because all she wants is acceptance and love. And that's tough. Both daughters may be attracted to people who are high in narcissistic traits for, again, the same reason. That is, we're drawn to the familiar. The combative mother, she's the feisty one. She's fighting because she wants you to be tough, and she believes in toughness. And so she doesn't believe in tears or crying or emotionality, because then you're a wimp. And this is a very tough household to grow up in, without question. And daughters take on different roles. They either become appeasers, or they fight back, they become rebels, or they become super avoidant of any kind of conflict. They become duck and cover people. So if you have a really combative mother, you may either become an appeaser and pleaser, a rebel who is in fact combative in her own ways that are negative, or you may be somebody who simply avoids conflict. Excuse me. All of the children who grow up in a combative mother's household are really, really sensitive to conflict. They're scared of showing their feelings. They're afraid that if they do show their weakness, they'll get picked on. So they have an impaired ability to manage emotions. Needless to say, they display as adults maladaptive behaviors if there's tension or stress, because conflict just unravels them. And they tend to self-isolate. These are, people who don't have a broad circle of friends. They feel more comfortable on their own, and avoid close relationships. The enmeshed mother is rarer than all of the others. The most enmeshed mothers are the stage mothers. Most often, excuse me, the enmeshed mother is a single mother. She might be widowed or divorced, and the enmeshed child is either the only child, or she is a child who is separated in years from her siblings. Here's the thing about the enmeshed mother. The enmeshed mother actually loves her child. That's what's really confusing about it, except that she can't tell the difference between her own needs sorry, and her child's needs. And so she's unbearably intrusive. Doesn't really permit her child to become independent, encourages dependency, tracks her all over the place. I mean, in today's day and age, she would be the mother who's constantly texting you every single second while you're in college or even as an adult. The problem with the enmeshed mother is that she does love you. It's just that her way of showing it is very damaging. So that the daughter who has an enmeshed mother feels alternatively angry, guilty, confused. she really doesn't know who she is separate from her mother. Sometimes, by the way, these daughters leave to go to college and then move back in with mom because they really can't function on their own. They're really stuck because on the one hand, they can't be fully independent, yet at the same time, they don't want to be dependent. So she too develops unhealthy coping mechanisms. And then, ultimately it's the stuckness because her mother loves her, but her mother's also imprisoning her. And finally, this is the least common pattern. This is the role reversed mother. This usually happens if the mother is very, very young when she has children, or is in very stressful economic situations where she really cannot deal with and cope with the household. And a child becomes the step-in, fill-in mom. Usually the oldest, but she might be the only girl, for example. And she does mom chores, and she takes on mom's role because mom sometimes can't. Needless to say, again, it's on the PowerPoint, she feels as though she was cheated of childhood. She feels as though she was pressured into maturity. She usually has poor social skills with peers and feels isolated. Again, she displays a kind of emotional confusion, like the enmeshed daughter, because she both loves and resents her mother. And she may make rash decisions to get out from under. From my interviews with daughters who had enmeshed mothers, they marry young and not always wisely to get out. Okay, up next. Now, this is when we start really unraveling the knottedness, becoming aware of how your behaviors are a response to hers. I can't totally read this because there's a screen here. All right. This is all about attachment. And attachment theory, which many of you know about, is very robust. It's been shown again and again to be highly reliable. And the key about attachment is that how we connect to our primary caretaker, most usually our mother, not only teaches us how the world of relationship works, but it also teaches us how to manage emotions. And that's very, very, very key, because loving mothers help teach their children not only that they're important and valued and supportive, but teach them how to cope and self-soothe when they are feeling sad or lonely or frightened. This does not happen with the insecurely attached child with an unloving mother. So again, to go back to this, it's not just what you learn about the world of relationship, whether it's a safe world, whether people are trustworthy or not, but it also has a great deal to do with the management of emotion. Okay, the three styles are anxious, preoccupied. The anxious, preoccupied daughter is someone who's always waiting for things to go wrong. She's anxious, and she's always sure that the other shoe is going to drop. And the analogy I always think of is, you go sailing on a completely blue sky, cloudless day, and the anxious, preoccupied daughter is the one who's scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. Now, this makes her, she's prone to read into situations. She's prone to overreact. She's hugely rejection sensitive. And so she's this very strange combination of things. She's both very volatile and gets angry, but she's also enormously clingy. And she's desperate for close connection, but she can't keep her balance. And she, too, needs to be in a relationship to feel validated. Many of you, I think, will identify with this style of attachment. Remember that these attachment styles are not written in stone. You may have one style at certain points in your life, and in one relationship or another, by the way. Fearful-Avoidant, the key thing here is fearful. This is a daughter who has learned not to trust. Childhood has taught her that people are unreliable. She doesn't think very well of herself, and she manages stress by pushing off from her feelings. I mean, she wants a relationship, but she just doesn't have the skill set. And finally, there's the Dismissive-Avoidant, and she's hugely armored. And, is pretty out there about the fact that she doesn't have much use for close relationships because she's A-okay on her own. And she floats in and out of relationships, including friendships, but always stays on an even keel. All right. Finally, managing the relationship. How to manage your relationship with your mother as an adult. And this is, really very problematic. And here are some predictable problems and obstacles. The first two, hopefulness and the dance of denial, and fear and self-doubt, actually come from the daughter's side. That's what daughters bring to the party. They're afraid to act because a piece of them still feels that somehow it will all be magically fixed. She'll say the right thing, something. Self-doubt, and I posted a piece about that today, plagues her because maybe she's wrong. Maybe she's really too sensitive. Maybe her mother's really normal. The next roadblocks to dialogue, of course, are coming from the maternal side. Now, that's going to be her denial, her refusal to take responsibility, and what I believe, which is that taking responsibility for her treatment of you would require her to own a boatload of shame, and that's tough stuff, because it's really important to remember that the mother myths bind mothers just as tightly as they bind daughters. How does a woman actually look at someone in the eyes and say, I never really loved you? How do you do that? So the possibilities for the daughter as an adult are really three: to set boundaries and rules of behavior, to go low contact, which usually involves distance. In other words, if you live significant miles away from your mother, you can probably manage low contact by keeping everything either in writing or a few telephone calls and the occasional visit. And many, many daughters, of course, do end up, alas, failing at low contact because their mothers simply will not respect boundaries, and they end up going no contact. Dealing with the fallout from going no contact is very, very difficult. There are great losses involved, and it's hard. Finally, redefining and understanding healing. One of the things that I feel very strongly, and I've come to feel even more strongly about recently, is that our whole idea of healing is just wrong. And I think that as you approach healing yourself, you have to think about what you define as healing. Again, we tend to think of healing as it means literally to make whole. But of course, you can't undo experience, can you? What you can do is you can stop reacting in the ways and acting and behaving in the ways that have stood in the way and act as obstacles to your being the best possible version of yourself. The metaphor I like is drawn from the Japanese art of kintsugi. And basically what they do is when something of value breaks, a piece of ceramic, rather than glue it together as we do in the West, which is when something is broken, we restore it so that you can't see that anything's happened to it. The Japanese take this completely other point of view, and they have been since the 15th century. What they do is they fill in the cracks with lacquer that actually has metal mixed into it. So basically you get these rivers of gold and silver or copper that become part of the piece. And so since it's impossible to completely erase our woundedness, I like the idea of rivers of gold, because that permits us, by the way, as we go through the process of healing, to see how healing itself has made us stronger, even though we know that there was evidence of original breakage. Self-compassion, learning to get rid of that critical tape in your head is so important, and drowning it out with not Pollyanna stuff about how great you are, but real observations about yourself, the self that your mother never saw, couldn't see. And that's a really important part of healing. And then finally, cultivating secure attachment. And again, I do so love the brain, because while the brain can really, lead us down the garden path, it actually can make new connections, and it keeps growing throughout our lifetimes. How nifty is that? So, in fact, even though your childhood bequeathed you a style of insecure attachment, you can actually cultivate what's called earned secure attachment. As you begin to change your behaviors, learn to self-soothe in the ways that secure people do, in part by bringing up visualizations and memories of people who were kind to you, people who were supportive, people who love you. And I think, Gabe, that's kind of where we are. I'm ready for questions if people have them.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Okay, let me pull up the questions. While I'm doing that, if anybody has a question, now is the time to please type it in. And Peg promises to answer as many of them as she can before we run out of time. So I've got the question console up now. There aren't currently any in there, but like I said, we always like to give it a moment so that as people are typing away, they can pop right in. How's the weather out where you are?
It's finally fall.
It's finally fall.
But I'm in New York, so it's finally fall. It stopped being August, which is about time. So
makes perfect sense. All right. Well, we've got a couple of questions popping in, so let me pop them right up so I can read them. The first one is a comment. I wish it were truly fall in Southern California. But the first question that we have is, what age and what to explain to your children as they start to wonder when or why and they do not see their grandparents? So what age should you explain why they don't see their grandparents if they've cut off contact with their mother?
I think that that's a very personal decision, and really depends on the maturity of the child. I went no contact with my mother when I was pregnant with my daughter. My daughter did not meet her grandmother. I believe she asked me, but she had she knew her father's mother, of course. I think she first asked me about it when she was maybe 4.5 or 5. And I told her an honest but abbreviated part of the story. And of course, older by the time she was 11, 12, 13. And I was also writing about mothers and daughters in the years of adolescence, it should be said at the time. So we were talking a lot about mother and daughter relationships, and she asked me more. I think judge their maturity. I don't think that children really need to know every detail, certainly, and be calm about it. In other words, don't inject whatever shame, ambivalence, cultural guilt that you may feel. Don't make it part of your conversation. Make it part of your adult choosing, which is admirable.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, and then the next question is, would all of this apply to fathers as well, or is it specifically just between mothers and daughters?
That's a good question and a really complicated one, actually. First of all, yes, fathers do matter. But the reality of it is that even today with, many households dominated by two people who are both working, the absolute lion's share of work and taking care of infants and small children still falls to women. So yes and no. And when the father's relationship to a daughter is quite specific and different, and not something that I could answer in a question. But no, it doesn't totally apply. The influence is different, in fact.
All right. And then the next question is, how can you start cultivating secure attachment?
You can start, again, remember that what I said before, we tend to think about attachment styles as being about relationships. That the mother teaches you that the world is a secure place, that people are trustworthy, that you can go out and be vulnerable, and it's a good thing, and intimacy is grand, right? But importantly, attachment theory from another point of view is actually also about self-regulation of emotion. And that's really, really, really important. So one way that you can cultivate secure attachment is by working on the management of emotion. Now, once you have begun to do that, and you recognize where your inability to manage emotions, in other words, you fight with someone and your initial impulse is to wall off and to retreat, right? You can't stop yourself from overreacting, or you're flooding with feelings and so forth. Those are all the things, by the way, if you think about it, that stop you from having fully satisfying relationships. So, in other words, in order to become securely attached and have relationships that are genuinely sustaining, interdependent, spiritually nourishing, right? You need to have been able to manage your emotions first, and then you are able to build a relationship with someone that indeed will have you respond in a way that a securely attached person does. An intimate relationship that is sustaining, of course, can also create earned attachment. It happens between patients and therapists, where, again, the unloved daughter feels secure enough, cared enough for, supported enough for, that she begins to do the work of managing her emotions, being able to see the world of relationship differently, not being as reactive to stress, disappointment, disagreements. So it's kind of a yin-yang thing. I hope that makes sense.
All right, thank you so much. And then another question is, how does the mother's death affect the healing process? And what are your thoughts on forgiveness? Is it overrated?
The mother's death. All right. What I call the core conflict, that is the conflict between the daughter's recognition of her woundedness versus her need for her mother's love, right? Keep those two things in your head. On the one hand, you know that it's hurting you. On the other hand, you still want her, right? The core conflict, alas, alack, is not automatically resolved by a mother's death. So, if you have not personally resolved the tension between those two impulses, that is, you are still continuing to yearn for and need your mother's love, your mother's death is going to pack a wallop even though she's been unloving. I mean, again, in my new book, I have a number of exercises and suggestions. I mean, one of the things that you do have to do, whether your mother is alive or not, actually, is you need to be able to mourn the mother you deserved. Not your mother, but the mother you deserved. And there was a second part of that question. Oh, forgiveness. A thorny question. It depends on your definition of forgiveness. Psychologists have looked at what forgiveness is and isn't. And, you know, if forgiveness means that you are letting go of your anger at the way that you were treated, then that's one thing. On the other hand, if you are in a continuing relationship with your mother and you are forgiving her because you believe that it is the high-minded thing to do, and that forgiveness becomes a permission slip for her to continue her maltreatment of you, it's probably not a very good idea. Forgiveness is it's very, very complicated because while we tend to think of it as the high road, the morally right thing to do, etc., it really all depends on context and whether or not the relationship with your mother is ongoing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And then the next question that we have on deck that disappeared on me. I know several family caregivers who are looking after mothers like the ones that you mentioned. What is some advice that I could give them?
Oh, you know, this sounds kind of like a cop-out, but it isn't. I don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all. Again, I started this. There's no one-size-fits-all answer because, again, I began this talk with, the generalizations that we can make about the mother-daughter relationship. But each family is really unique, and the patterns in it are unique, and the history of it is unique. And the degree to which, a daughter, if the caretaker is in fact a daughter, a great deal of it will depend on her motivation, actually. I mean, my mother is long since gone from this earth, but I can tell you absolutely bluntly that there is no way that I would have been a caretaker for my mother. None. So, I mean, again, this bumps right into the whole question of filial duty and how far filial duty goes and so forth. And it's a complicated question. And there isn't one size fits all answer. There just isn't. Not very satisfying, but sorry, it's the best I can do.
Hey, honesty is very vital when handing out information. All right, the next question is, after boundaries are set and the daughter is gone low contact, Is it normal for a mother to keep coming after her daughter and trying to make amends or demanding an explanation for the lack of content? Or, I'm sorry, for the lack of contact?
I am laughing because some of the stories I have heard from my readers are just extraordinary. See, again, yes, put it this way. Is it normal? No, it's not normal. Does it happen often? Uh-huh. I mean, the problem is, particularly if the mother is controlling or combative or high in narcissistic traits, right? She needs to win this. And besides, if she likes controlling her daughter, if she likes pushing her around, if she needs her as a revolving sun, that mom is not going to quietly sit there alone in the sandbox. She wants her daughter back in. I have had daughters tell me about literal campaigns of either cajoling, promises, I'll change, right, to literally, symbolic warfare, spreading lies in an effort to get the daughter back into the game and so forth. So these are very scary scenarios, and they, in fact, in my new book, I described a couple of them, and I said, if you put them in a novel, an editor would probably put a question mark and say, oh, come on. But the truth is it happens, and it's not that weird. My own mother was actually happier when I was out of her life because I was, from her point of view, I was a symbol of her failure as a person. So I went no contact with my mother over the course of 2 decades, probably at least 4 times, and then finally permanently. And never once over those 2 decades did she ever try to effect a reconciliation. So she was actually happy that I was finally gone and that she didn't have to bear the burden of shame. In other words, her party line was, well, Peg was always so difficult. We knew that. But no, it does happen.
Thank you so much for your honesty. All right, we've got a couple more here. Many people, of course, they wanted to thank you for giving them information, and they're pleased, and they're sharing a variety of parts of their stories and how much they relate to it, etc. Another question that we have is, I'm in my 50s. I recently went no contact without any explanation. Do I need to explain it to them, or do I need to give a reason? And the concern, of course, is, like you mentioned, that they will be gaslighted if they open up the conversation to explain why they went no contact.
Again, this is really up to you. The reality of it is that you could write them, the world's longest letter, and the likelihood is that they would simply say, it never happened. We didn't do that. You're too sensitive. I mean, again, I have experienced, daughters have told me stories of reconciliation, and this isn't meant cynically, but truthfully, the stories of reconciliation that I have heard between adult daughters and mothers are mothers who either suffered from mental illness that was untreated for years and then was treated, or suffered from addiction and changed their lives. In other words, those are the stories of reconciliation that I have heard, where a mother has had an underlying problem that she has addressed. She recognizes her behavior as a mother, her treatment of her child, and makes a pact to rebuild. I don't hear lots and lots of stories from these other maternal types who are, essentially healthy and functioning people, by the way, who, for many reasons and no reason at all, have not done their jobs as mothers. So I guess what I'm saying is totally up to you, but, you don't owe them an explanation, in my opinion. So.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everybody, for tuning in. This brings us to the end of our broadcast. Thank you, Peg. Do you have any last words before we go ahead and disconnect?
No, sorry for my coughing. I don't know what happened. And it was great talking to you all. And don't forget to read the blog at Psych Central. And do look out for my new book, Daughter Detox, Recovering from an Unloving Mother and Reclaiming Your Life. And it'll be available at Amazon in the next couple of weeks.
That is
thank you all.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much. And my name is Gabe Howard with the PsychCentral.com Psych Central Show podcast, and we will see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.